As a business leader, have you found sometimes you've been busy working on something unrelated and suddenly a great creative idea that pops into your head that adds value to your product, that helps you solve a problem, but because you're busy, you decide to just put it off, and when you're finished, you're going to record that idea or act on that idea. But by the time you get back to that idea, sometimes even just a few minutes later, it's gone, it's lost, and you may never recover it again. It's kind of a waste. So this video is for business leaders who want to maximize their productivity, prosperity, and profits by capturing all their most valuable creative ideas at the right time and in the right way. So watch to the end of this video for bonus material on increasing your creativity and a recommended video on the neuroscience of attention and creativity. The reason I developed this simple yet obvious strategy is that as somebody with ADHD, forgetfulness comes with the territory, but I would go so far as to say being human, forgetfulness comes with the territory. Even those who are like memory champions, unless they plug whatever they're trying to remember into the system, they forget their grocery list too, unless they intentionally encode it into their memory system, their mnemonics and stuff. So forgetfulness comes with the territory, I think, of being human, but in particular in somebody like my case. But this same strategy will, of course, help you capture and act on not just your creative ideas, but any ideas. I'm just plugging this into my theme for this week, or these 10 days, which is creativity, and because it happens. So it's essentially a matter of acting on your creativity the moment it occurs and before you forget. There it is. There's the secret sauce. Now, this is really important because oftentimes that's what happens. If we wait, we may get distracted, and in sort of memory or cognitive terms, it's called interference, especially if suddenly something comes to our attention or we have to deal with something that is related or similar. It's like you're trying to sum numbers in your head or do something in your head, and someone comes along and says something closely related, like you're trying to add numbers together and somebody else comes along and you overhear a phone number and now you forgot all your numbers and you got to start over. That's interference. So for a lot of reasons, it's actually really important. You should try to stop and capture as much as you can, and there's a better option even than that, which I'll get into later in this video. So essentially, you should take some action immediately to at least capture the essence of the idea long enough for you then to be able to fill it out. But be careful about doing that, how you do that too. So if you can't act immediately, which is ideal, that is quite literally drop everything to at least get something started, oftentimes that's not the case. But if you must document, don't be fooled by your overconfidence bias. That is your tendency to believe that you're overconfident. Everybody believes, or almost everybody believes, they're in the top 50% of drivers, which of course is statistically impossible. But there's a whole bunch of research about this area that people are just radically overconfident about many things and their own capabilities, and this would include your memory. So when you do this, keep this Chinese saying in mind: the faintest ink is more powerful than the strongest memory. Now, I actually do this digitally, so the faintest pixels, the faintest coding is better than the strongest memory. So if you can't do your creative thing immediately, document it immediately instead. This might mean pausing what you're doing. That is typically less harmful, especially in terms of how this will help you perpetuate creativity in your brain and the way you're sort of programming it by taking on that behavior. So by acting on it is by far the best option because of the psychology, because of psychological and behavioral momentum. Tripping over my words today. So both those things are what they sound like. It's the tendency to keep going mentally, that would be the psychological momentum, and the behavioral, the tendency to stay in action. It's like, well, I've started now, I may as well keep going, that kind of thing. So that's an actual thing. So Creative actions and ideas beget more creative actions and ideas, whereas documenting them, then returning to potentially uncreative work tends to kill that creative flywheel. So if you can pause what you're doing, if that's possible, that, in my opinion, is a strong advantage. So it's like, okay, let's give this a try, or let's get this project started based on this creative idea, because you've switched now tracks to that creative idea. It will keep you going. It's probably one of the reasons people always argue that it maybe takes 20 minutes to get back to full functionality, cognitive functionality, after you've been distracted. I would be skeptical of any cut and dried numbers like that, but the question is, it's not really in question whether distractions disrupt you and it takes you time to get back up to speed. So same here, that idea is already in your head. If you can act on it immediately, you can make, as I said, psychological, let's call it even creative momentum to keep down that path. And so there's a lot of advantages for you acting on it if you possibly can. But again, if you must document, just make sure, because of the overconfidence bias I was talking about before, make sure to include enough detail that you will know exactly what you meant, even if you don't see it again for a year or more. Now, I've got a lot of experience at this because in doing these videos, at sometimes I have 50 episodes ahead. That is 50 themes ahead of the one I'm actually working on. And I just wrote down something which is cryptic, but of course I knew what it was. I was the author and I was thinking about it, but I was overconfident. And later on, it came down to it was like, I have no idea what this means. So don't assume by the time you get to this idea, write it as though you won't return to it for a year, and that if you read it in a year, you would fully understand the idea that you were trying to convey, not something cryptic, unless you only are going to be away from it for a few minutes or an hour or something. Even then, you're risking losing the idea. So try to write it out. Don't be overconfident about your understanding of something you wrote an extended period of time ago. Fill in the details as far as you reasonably can. Complete sentences to really get the essence without overwriting. So maybe it's just a couple sentences, but a few words or one sentence, be careful. So I've made this mistake, as I already talked about. So we don't need that part. So it has happened that a few months later, I looked at it and it was like, I have no idea what the heck I was talking about, like zero idea. And I lost the idea and the episode. I'm sure it was good, but I simply forgot it because I was overconfident and I underdescribed it to the point where even myself couldn't reproduce the idea. So you can even do this to go to the next level, and as a cognitive trick, strive to document it well enough that anyone who knows the vocabulary understands your idea. That is, as long as, if it's technical, fine. But if somebody who is not the author looked at it after the fact that they can clearly understand it, then it's that much more likely that you yourself, the actual author, will understand it after an extended period of time, if it's a long time, a year before you get to the idea. So if anything, you'd be better to err on the side of over describing and assuming you'll remember nothing but what's documented. So document everything you need to get the real essence. Don't, like I said, better to underestimate your ability to remember it and overestimate the necessary description. It's still likely going to be a few sentences, probably less. So immediately after documenting it, get back to your current task if you aren't able to capitalize on the creative momentum we already described. You may also want to experiment with taking a meal break, a meal or break, to see which works best for you, because there's something called the fresh start effect, which isn't exactly what we're talking about here, but you've already shifted. You've already went from one cognitive gear doing your task to coming up with your creative idea and then documenting it. Now, whether you document it or act on it immediately, which I think is the better of the two options, then when you're finished doing a necessary portion of that, taking a break and basically downtime might be better than trying to shift back into your other activity, because you've still got that creativity, that idea flywheel, which will now interfere with the task you were initially doing. It might be better to take a break. It might make no difference for you, which is why we encourage you to try both. So now back to the goals. If you can run down that creative rabbit hole, awesome. I would encourage you to do that. And of course, this technique, this proposal, this idea, test it against yourself, because it doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't even matter what science says about this. It matters what works for you. But my intuition and my scientific knowledge says it makes perfect sense, cognitively speaking, that this is beneficial, and it reflects accurately on my experience, though I've never done any kind of experiment on this, which is why I'm considering it more speculation, well-informed. So take advantage of that momentum while your creativity is flowing. So that's it for the main part. We're already to the bonus material. And while creative flashes are great, and they don't always come when you want them to, or maybe as often as you want them to, therefore, training yourself to have more of them can be even better than having them in general. So one way to do that is to wake up your inner child by making a habit of learning more about anything surprising or unexpected. So if you are walking down the street and you see something interesting that catches your eye in a store window, go check it out. Maybe learn a little bit more about it, or you're reading an article or you're doing whatever and you hear a phrase or you see something really interesting, go learn something about it. I'll give you an example of this. There's something, and I'm probably saying the German wrong, but called a Halbach array. I'll show you one. Okay, so a Halbach array has absolutely nothing to do with neuroscience, which is what I normally talk about. It has everything to do with physics and magnetics. By the arrangement, I'll see if you can see that. Oh, that is so cool. Ooh. By the arrangement of these magnets, all of the magnetic field is probably dead now. The strength of the magnetic field on one side is all of it has been pushed to one side. It's weak on the inside and strong on the outside. It's a very fascinating thing. The only reason I know this is that I was looking for something, and this idea of the Halbach array jumped out at me. I was like, I've never heard of that. I'm a science geek. I usually know a little bit about things like generators. And I went down that rabbit hole and found out how this was created maybe 20 or 30 years ago, maybe more, but something that I was completely unaware of because I followed my curiosity trail down that rabbit hole. I learned something super valuable. But that's only one example of why you do this. Essentially, it has less to do with that than it does with simply putting yourself into the cognitive habit, putting your brain in the habit of pursuing novel, interesting things that catch your attention, that are unexpected, and you get bonus points if it's something completely outside of your experience and knowledge base. Now, magnets and generators were not outside of my experience and knowledge base, but this particular thing, this Halbach array, I had never heard of it. I knew nothing about it, and it was super valuable for me to go after that. But that has a lot less to do with it than anything. It's essentially getting your brain in the habit of noticing novel, unique, and surprising things, especially if they're outside of your knowledge or awareness, general awareness, your general knowledge. And because the more you do that, this is like anything else, it's a habit. You're training your brain to be, to encourage your muse or your creative flashes to come more. Why? Well, because you are giving a memo, more than likely, let's call this, to your reticular activating system, that I'm interested in new and interesting things. I like to learn about new and interesting things. And your RIS will pay more attention, and there's more about that coming up in the bonus video. But essentially, the more you do any habit, especially a cognitive habit, The more you do something with your brain, the better your brain tends to get at it, especially if you do it at a challenging level. And novelty introduces a challenge because you don't know anything about it. So it takes more cognitive effort than something you already know. And it's also intrinsically more rewarding because novelty is a fundamental part of what makes our motivation as humans, because it's good in the right context where it's safe. So you can maybe make your muse visit you more. And to take this to the next level, simply do this. Learn something new every day, even if only for a few minutes. You probably heard this before, but how many people do you know who actually learn something new every day? Probably not that many, but people like Bill Gates reads a book a week. I believe Warren Buffett reads 500 pages a day. It doesn't have to be reading. Just learn something new every day as a habit, again, as a way to train your brain to be seeking new knowledge. And the more knowledge you have, the more you have to draw creative energy or creative ideas from, because you've got a bigger base. So that's it. And my recommended video for today is the neuroscience of attention and creativity. I'll put the link there, and I will put it in the description as well. So it will essentially increase your creativity by increasing what you notice. And this is about the reticular activating system. So please share this video with, if you enjoyed it, even if you didn't, please share this video with anybody who you think would benefit from it. This has been Crush It Club 249, Act Immediately on Creativity. My name is Tim B. Green. Bye for now.